Warning: Ukraine must leave Kursk, or it will be time for the nukes. Also, the United States must not provide lethal aid to Ukraine, or it will be time for the nukes. Alternatively, Canada becomes the 51st state, or else. The purchase of Greenland and all of its riches, or else. The annexation of the Panama Canal and access to a key world choke point, or else. Turning the Gaza Strip into the next French Riviera, or else. Tariff threats being levied at uncountably many countries, or else. It seems that everyone suddenly became curious about how to negotiate with an irrational actor. Regardless of what you think of the Kremlin's various red lines, or Trump's foreign policy splashes over the first month of his presidency, how to negotiate with an irrational actor is not actually as interesting of a question as it may seem. Not to worry, this will still be an interesting video despite that claim. It is just that if all we had to worry about was a single individual's irrationality, we would simply diagnose the variety of irrationality and move on with our lives. Rather, the more interesting question is how a rational actor should negotiate when the opposing side has the perception that he may be irrational, and how the opponent navigates the uncertainty of the rational-irrational divide. Today, we will see that it is perfectly rational to be irrational, or at least a little bit anyway. We will also work through an opponent's dilemma in calling what it might see as a rational bluff from the main actor in an attempt to feign irrationality. But most importantly, we will discover that the madman theory of international politics is not all that it is cracked up to be. Specifically, that outside of extreme circumstances, feigning irrationality leaves the would-be madman no better off than if the world knew outright that he was a perfectly rational creature. You know what? You would almost have to be a madman to follow all of the news that is happening right now. It feels like every day is basically a month at this point. As a result, it is easy for some stories to slip through the cracks, like this one about 2 U.S. Navy vessels transiting the Taiwan Strait, which received precious little attention from left-leaning news sources. Now, how do I stay afloat under these circumstances? Well, it is all thanks to this video's sponsor and a returning favorite, Ground News. They will cover your news blind spots and even give you insight about the ownership of the news sources that you read, like whether they are government-owned or not. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps, you can get 40% off their Vantage plan. That is how I get all of this information, and now you can too. So check the video description below or scan the QR code on your screen to get started today. Let's begin by working through a common incentive structure that you will immediately recognize as omnipresent in international relations. It takes a basic form that begins by one actor deciding whether to issue a threat or not. No threat, no more interaction. But following a threat, the opponent hears it and must decide whether to escalate by ignoring the verbal barbs or concede the policy. If the opponent fails to accommodate, the ball is back in the first actor's court. You must choose whether to follow through on a punishment or give up on the issue. Obviously, this is a bit bare bones, but you can see how the structure reoccurs across a variety of issue areas. Crack down on illegal border crossings, or else. Hey, you too, Canada, especially that 43 pounds of fentanyl, or else. Terminate Chinese investment in your country, or else. Give us Greenland, again, because it's beautiful, or else. Absent any threats, the status quo is kept. A threat that the opponent concedes to is very good for the initial actor, but very bad for the opponent. Meanwhile, a threat that the opponent escalates, but the first actor does not follow up on, is worse than the status quo for both. That is because nothing substantive changes, but it injects enough uncertainty into investors' minds to rattle both countries' economies. Of course, that is still better than the awful outcome that arises for both if the actor follows through. Okay, nuclear weapons might be a little dramatic for something like Greenland, But the point is that full escalation is the worst outcome for both sides. Now, this template is the interaction that we will be analyzing today, but let's call some guy Trump to make our lives a little easier. It could also be Putin facing the West, of course, but let's just stick to this one for simplicity. If everyone is known to be rational here, how should these two reason through their dilemmas? Well, the important first note is that, when push comes to shove, Trump should hold off on following through with the punishment. Remember, we are assuming rationality here. Giving up is bad, sure, but actually burning down the world is worse. That leads to an important inference for the opponent. Standing firm appears to be a scary option, because it opens up the possibility of a catastrophic outcome, or so it would seem. In actuality, though, the disaster outcome is a phantom concern. That is because Trump will simply give up when it gets to the endgame. Thus, the real choice is between giving up on the policy and forcing Trump to back down. The latter clearly produces the better endgame for the opponent, so the opponent ought to go with that. Working back a step, Trump should internalize that even starting the crisis ultimately traps himself in a position where he loses. The possibility of reaching an opposing concession is a phantom one, for similar reasons as last time. Therefore, he should not issue the threat in the first place. Simple enough. Here is a puzzle for you, though. Put yourself in the shoes of the opponent. Imagine that you observe the threat being issued. What the heck are you supposed to infer about Trump now? An initial threat was not supposed to happen. The rational version of Trump would not want to walk down that road, because it ultimately leads to a political black eye for no benefit. But he has. So can you really infer that he will give up at the end, as he rationally should, if you refuse to concede the issue? Because if not, then you should indeed bow out and avoid the disastrous outcome. Fortunately, there is a better way to think about the situation. Imagine that there is some small possibility that Trump is completely irrational, say 1%. In the context here, irrationality means that he takes the most aggressive action at every opportunity, ignoring any strategic incentives that may exist. Actually, we do not really need to make such an assumption. It could be that Trump, for whatever reason, simply values those outcomes more than anything else. Maybe he just enjoys all of the media coverage that would come with a deepening crisis. If so, then he would rationally be aggressive all the way through. Regardless, we do not need to waste any time explaining why that might be the case. Let's just stick to irrationality and see what happens next. Well, the implications for what an irrational Trump would do are not particularly interesting. You see, he is always aggressive by assumption, and whether he ends up observing the opponent choose to concede the issue or escalate it into a disaster, it is squarely in the hands of the opponent. Consequently, it is the opponent that has a sort of interesting strategic dilemma, at least for now. If the opponent anticipated that the rational Trump would never issue a threat to begin with, but now he has issued one, the only conclusion left to draw is that Trump must be irrational, and thus he will instigate a disaster if the opponent escalates. In turn, the opponent has but one best response: to concede the issue. But now is where things get truly interesting. Think about this from the perspective of a fully rational Trump. And we are going to have to get into very stable genius mode, because he is about to get very tricky indeed. If Trump were to initiate the crisis, he would trick the opponent into thinking that he is irrational, and thus induce him to concede, even though Trump would ultimately give up if push came to shove, because he is actually rational. That generates a better outcome for Trump than simply accepting the status quo from the start. Thus, he should opt for a bluff. This is the basis of the madman theory of international politics. Its heyday was back during the Nixon administration. The basic idea is that a non-crazy person has an incentive to act crazy, to convince others that he is truly crazy, and then reap some benefit as a consequence of that belief. For Nixon, it was convincing North Vietnam that he was so unhinged that he might use nuclear weapons if he did not get his way. The problem with the portrayal of the madman theory is that it basically stops the analysis at, hey, they think I am crazy, and then hand waves how exactly the better outcomes come to fruition. Well, at the risk of being the game theorist in the room, I think that we should explore this a little bit further. And at the further risk of being a buzzkill, magical benefits are not exactly forthcoming. My self-respecting academic alter ego would want to specify payoffs for each of those outcomes, and then solve the game as a function of general values. And indeed, he has done something to that effect before regarding economic sanctions. But let me just walk you through the top-line problem using the words on the screen. The flaw in the logic is how the opponent would respond to the threat, and naively assuming that the best course of action is to simply fold when it is time to move. But that is not consistent with the opponent's own expectation about how the rational type of Trump would take advantage of the situation. You see, if both rational and irrational Trumps make the threat, then the opponent believes 99% of the time that it is facing a rational Trump, despite apparent evidence to the contrary. In turn, unless the disaster outcome is really, really bad, and implausibly so for all of those territorial-based Trump threats against allies, remember that the nuclear weapon over there is supposed to be a metaphor, it is better to run the risk and escalate the crisis, anticipating that 99% of the time, the still rational Trump will cave in, and only 1% of the time will the opponent suffer the consequences. Of course, at that point, the rational Trump would realize that actually it would not be a good idea to make the threat at all, and so he would not go down that path in the first place. But then the opponent would conclude upon observing the threat that Trump is irrational. Therefore, the opponent would want to back down. But that would encourage, once again, the rational Trump to make the threat. But then the opponent would reason that Trump is almost certainly going to eventually back down, because Trump is almost certainly rational. But then the rational Trump would not make the initial threat at all. Yuck. Seems like there is no end to this strategic loop. Well, fortunately, there is a way out. And, ironically enough, it involves the rational Trump acting unpredictably, sometimes choosing to make the threat, and sometimes maintaining the status quo. That leaves the opponent unsure what to do, and indeed baits the opponent into occasionally backing down, as the rational Trump would hope for. But here is the thing. The opponent still needs to check the rational Trump's potential bluff by escalating, lest it be overrun by a certain threat from the rational Trump. However, the opponent should not just randomly choose between its two options. Instead, it ought to mix in a specific manner that makes the rational Trump find no additional value from trying the gambit, as compared to just quitting before it starts. Specifically, it needs to escalate some portion of the time, and punish the rational Trump by forcing him to back down. And therein lies key point number 1. None of us know how these situations are going to end ahead of time, because, for us to know, the actors would have to be behaving predictably. But that is exactly the opposite of what the rational Trump and the folks in Greenland, Canada, or Panama, or whoever else is in the situation should be doing. Small side note here. If you think that Trump is an irrational creature, and your evidence for this are the actions that he has taken thus far, well, that is exactly the rational type's goal, isn't it? Therefore, confusion reigns. Happily, I have now fulfilled February's quota of reminders that international relations analysts should not be promoting false certainty. And it also gets us to the second key point. In all but extreme cases, the whole ability to mimic an irrational type's behavior ends up generating no expected benefit at all. Whatever gains that could be made by observing the opponent back down are exactly offset by the risk that the opponent escalates instead, which causes Trump to give up and the whole thing to backfire. In fact, the only way for a madman principle to be profitable is if the opponent's initial belief that Trump is irrational is so high that the opponent would prefer to back down, even if the opponent knew that the rational Trump would always escalate. If so, the bluff always works, and so the alleged madman always gets his way. There is no risk of punishment. This is much more plausible when we are thinking about escalation risks that could lead to nuclear war. But even in affairs involving Russia, it requires a decent belief that Putin is irrational to get deterrence to work properly. Still, it makes sense why there is more caution in that arena. On the flip side, to each their own, I suppose, but I do not believe that foreign leaders think that they are in that type of situation with Trump. Meanwhile, you can make a rational decision by checking out Ground News and using the QR code here to get a great discount on their Vantage plan. It will help you check whom exactly you are getting your news from, and where national or ideological bias may be seeping in. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.